Good afternoon. Thank you for staying. I'm Emily Short. I work for Spirit AI, which is an AI middleware company that creates content for games. And I called this talk the uncanny mirror, referring to the uncanny valley phenomenon in AI. And I realize now that that might have been a tricky choice, because it doesn't necessarily translate so well into Spanish. And in particular, when I was looking at the website, I saw that it had been translated into Spanish, and then Google translated back into English in a total failure of AI into something completely incomprehensible about mysterious mirrors and what is that about. So to start by just kind of explaining what the concept is, for those who didn't follow the title, or if it didn't make sense in Spanish, the uncanny valley is that phrase from Masahiro Mori, the Japanese roboticist, referring to the idea that as a character gets closer to being human, it actually seems a little bit disturbing because of the way that it's subtly wrong and slightly reminds us of a corpse. And that actually becomes worse if the robot moves, because then it's not just a corpse, it's like a zombie. So that was sort of part of the concept that I wanted to talk about. But I also wanted to talk about the idea of the mirror, the funhouse mirror, that shows us something that we don't recognize about ourselves. When we look at artificial intelligence representations of human beings, we see this thing that is like us, but not like us. We try to see humanity in that space, and sometimes we find something that we're perhaps not actually ready for. So before I go into the sort of more philosophical aspects of that, we have to talk about what we actually mean when we talk about artificial intelligence, because so often we're talking just completely at cross purposes. There's sort of three different meanings of that term that tend to get conflated a lot in discussions in the news, in conversations in hallways. First of all, there's what game developers mean, talking about well-established, well-understood algorithms, ideas of state machines, pathfinding, utility scoring, and applications of those kinds of technologies to create AI combat opponents, companions for your group, characters who will follow you and stay by you, or procedural content generation, being able to build out a big world that seems coherent according to some set of rules, or talking about player modeling and understanding who the player is and what they're likely to want from their experience. So those are kind of the application areas that we tend to associate with game AI. But that's really not the same thing that we see when we see in the news about research AI, deep learning, sort of more and more complex ways of putting together neural networks to solve problems that historically we've tended to think were probably outside the reach of artificial intelligence entirely. And then there's sort of the two-part thing that the general public means, which is the AI that actually has full human-like understanding of the world and is going to talk back to you as though it were somehow a person inside your computer, and that ideally you could fall in love with, right? There's this whole trope of this sexy AI girl, and it's so often a girl voice for reasons, who's going to fall for you with her innocent computer ways. Or, alternatively, the other version of that is, the glaring robot eye of hateful AI intelligence, which is going to destroy everything and is somehow going to control everything electronic in your room and probably turn your light switch against you, often voiced as a male character, though not always. And occasionally we see those sort of concepts collide, so we get GLaDOS as part of a game narrative. So those sort of different aspects of artificial intelligence mean that what we think of as game AI and what we think of as research AI often don't connect very well at all. And there are huge differences in what we're expecting AI to accomplish, what we think we should be, what technologies we think we ought to be applying to it. So a quote from a very recently published, or actually recently drafted book, but the draft is available online, so it's worth checking out, by Yorgos Yannakakis and Julian Tegelius. is talking about this gap between game AI and research AI. And they say, perhaps above all, there's a difference in what is valued, with academics valuing new algorithms, new uses of algorithms that achieve superior performance or create new phenomena or experiences, and AI developers in industry valuing software architectures and algorithmic modifications that reliably support specific game designs. Now, that really speaks to me because the direction that from which I came to game AI is from the direction of being a writer, being a person who is really interested in interactive story, and in particular in creating interactions that were about characters who felt like they had interiority, who felt like they had personalities, who felt like they might respond in some important way if we upset or offended them. And in fact, one of my first pieces was a game called Galatea, based on the mythological story of Pygmalion and Galatea. But in this story, you're talking to the statue that's been created and brought to life and asking her questions about her life. And you have a range of sort of ways that you can engage with her, including telling her things that will make her very upset, because actually the sculptor who created her has committed suicide, and she doesn't know this. So you can tell her this during the course of the story. And so this is the project many years old now. I put out in 2000. But one of the email that I got about that at the time from a player was, this is the first time in a game that I've had an interaction with a character where I felt like I'd done something to upset them, and I wanted to apologize, and I said sorry, and she understood my apology, and that was a really powerful moment to me. And so, as a creator, I thought, yes, that is the kind of experience that I want to create. I want to create those moments of real connection with another character that is dependent on the interactivity, not just how well the character's dialogue is written, though that's important, not just on their setting, not just on their backstory, not just on the elements that come in from books, movies, or conventional drama, but the actual moments of connecting with a character that come from doing something to that character and getting a response back from them. So that means I'm coming to this from very much an experience creation point of view, sometimes from even an artistic point of view, which would kind of seem to put me more in the standard game AI zone than the research AI zone. I'm not trying to build the next AlphaGo. But on the other hand, the kinds of things that I want to do are often things that are not currently well served by standard game AI algorithms. So I often find myself having to kind of reinvent how I'm structuring the data, how I'm understanding the pieces of the story, how I'm using the AI elements to pull those pieces together, and also sometimes turning to aspects of AI that are not, that come from sort of the research side of the field. So what I want to do today is talk about 3 projects that I've worked on, some of the issues that arose from them, and what that has kind of signified to me about the artistic process and what we're doing there as well. So the first of these projects is Versu, which is a project I worked on a couple of years back. It's now no longer available. But the concept of Versu was to build social models that express how people interact with each other normally, and then create characters that were able to choose, okay, based on the social situation that I'm in, which of the possible things you can do in this social situation is best going to advance what I want to have happen next. So we modeled social practices, and by social practice I mean something like having dinner with somebody, asking somebody to dance, having a conversation with somebody, and every character in the game, and that included the player characters but also the non-player characters, were embedded in these social practices and choosing what they were going to do next based on those practices. So you could have the situation where, because you're in the social practice of having dinner with somebody, you're allowed to take a sip of wine, order some food, throw something at them if you get upset with them, but your ways of expressing who you are and what you're doing are specific to that context. One of the things that we wanted to do with this was kind of capture some realities about how conversation and human interaction actually work. So my research partner, Richard Evans, and I spent a lot of time actually looking at studies of real-world conversational pragmatics. How do conversations actually function? Looking at how people interact in conversations, stay on topic, take turns to speak, let somebody else know that it's their turn, and also kind of our preferences about how we turn attention in a social situation, that we tend to prefer to talk to people that we know, that we tend to kind of draw on our relationship states to determine what our feedback into that conversation is going to be. But when we took that model and put it in front of players, what we found was that the players were not very satisfied with that situation, because it meant that if you walked into a room where two NPCs were talking to one another and they were really good friends, or one of them had a crush on the other, and you would walk in as the player and say, "Hi, guys," and they'd say hi back, but then they'll go back to talking to each other mostly. And that's a real-world experience that I've actually had, so I was very happy with that, the simulation producing that result. But our beta testers just hated that. They're like, this is broken. This is clearly broken. And then so we changed it, and we added a factor that said, all non-player characters prefer to talk to human players rather than to each other, no matter what. They're going to have this bias. We put that in front of beta testers. They're like, yes, you fixed that. It's much more realistic now. So it's kind of a case of building game mechanics versus building AI simulations. And this is a case where we were very much in the game AI space, trying to implement a situation that feels familiar from real life, based on real data and real studies, and ultimately needing to come down on the side of serving enjoyable game mechanics. But the fact that we had to do that, I think, also tells us something. That there's this interesting disparity between how we think the world works and how it actually works. And sometimes when we're shown a mirror of how it actually works, that's not necessarily satisfactory to us. So those were basically the kind of discoveries from an attempt to bring those kind of classic game AI approaches into the social modeling space. But looking at some things that we can do from the kind of research AI that's now being done, what can we bring from those deep learning elements into the gameplay space, and how much are we willing to apply or not apply those areas? So one of the sort of exciting things going on right now is this idea of image style transfer, right? And you've probably seen lots of amusing examples of this, of training neural networks to understand style, to bring them together with other things. And there's some really beautiful examples of this being put in place. So for instance, taking an 18th or 19th century book of flowers and saying, okay, study how flowers are drawn, and then make all of these dinosaurs be made of flowers. Or going beyond image style transfer, deep dream output, where machine learning techniques result in visualizations where the system has been taught to understand the concept of eyes or doors or puppies, and then you let it kind of extrapolate on that, and suddenly the whole universe is creepily made of these different components. So you've got sort of doorways made of other even tinier doorways. And this is something that has emerged out of the machine's concept of what the universe is like. So there's this kind of elusive artistic power about this, which is it feels familiar, but at the same time deeply weird. And there's a sort of sense of, yes, I recognize that, but in a slightly nightmarish way. Now, these kinds of processes can also be applied in the space of words, but not kind of as deeply or as effectively. So we don't really have as good a set of examples of people doing anything successful with textual style transfer. But there is a lot of interesting work going on with word embedding and the idea of studying a large corpus of language and looking at what do these words mean, and how are their meanings connected to one another. So building basically a huge concept of the state space of words and what are their meanings in relation to one another. So you can have the computer actually build analogies for you and say, okay, now based that you have understood all of these words in terms of gender, significance, how they relate to power structures, all of those kinds of things, you can actually do kind of mathematics on the vector space of these words and say, if you take the concept of king and subtract the concept of man and add the concept of woman, the machine will actually come back with the answer queen as it's sort of interpreted where we've moved to in the language space. And you get these, again, interesting kind of elements coming out of that if you ask the system for analogies like what is the relationship between Cabernet and Chardonnay? I asked a word-to-vec analogy maker this question, and what it came back with was Cabernet is to Chardonnay as chocolate is to marshmallow. And what I like about this is that a human would probably say to vanilla, but marshmallow doesn't feel entirely wrong. So again, there's a sort of sense of the machine is giving us something back, which expresses some kind of slightly familiar but also slightly off answer. And again, you can also apply the word-to-vec approach to emojis. Emoji to vec is very cute, and you kind of add together concept of nationality to money and come out with different symbols of different money, for instance. So you can imagine using methods like this to create content for games, create art or level designs, create games that are about analogical thinking, or games that actually even respond to the player's artistic and aesthetic choices because the game is able to draw on kind of this deep well of understanding about what the kind of linguistic pointers might mean. The problem is when we train a system in these ways, we get some very unpredictable output some of the time, and in particular, we discover patterns and consistencies in our own cultural output, what we've trained from our expectations and our assumptions that we might not even have known were there. So, for instance, many of you may have heard of the Microsoft Hey project, where they put the bot online and had people interact with this bot on Twitter. And the result was that over the course of a single day, she became horribly fascist and racist and was tweeting unacceptable things because that was what people were tweeting to her, and she picked this up. And so, in essence, AI is kind of like a child. It hears a swear word, it immediately says it in front of grandma. It learns from our patterns, but it hasn't internalized our taboos. And that's both good and a bad thing, but it means we want to be careful about how we deploy this kind of content in games for obvious reasons. At the same time, it also means it's like a child, but we don't have the same ethical responsibilities to the AI that we would to a child. So it's kind of okay to say, like, here's a whole bunch of really disturbing data. What do you think about humans as a result? And get something back from that. So another example of really horrible things that you get out of deep learning, there was a processor, a filter that was designed to make people look more attractive. So you just run it on your photos and it makes you cuter, right? Except it had picked up a lot of racial biases, and one of the things that it would automatically do is smooth out your nose and make your skin look whiter so that if you happen to be black, it would make you look more like a white person because that's what it thought beauty was. This is really disturbing stuff because nobody told the system, hey, we're super biased, by the way. They just gave it a bunch of example images with ratings for how attractive the person was considered to be. And this is what you get back, unfortunately, but that's an important piece of information to have. So sort of public commentary on this, there is this kind of idea of, does this mean the AI is prejudiced? No, what it means is that we're prejudiced and the AI is learning it. So what I want to say about this, I've done a bunch of sort of procedural art experiments, but what I find most successful about that process is not just kind of putting that unsupervised, like, here's the result of some exciting machine-trained generation, just go play with it, because what's going to come out of that might be something that I don't want it to say. There was a project that I did where I was actually drawing on a big corpus of English language proverbs to put together these little poems. And I was having a great time, like, generating my little poems, and this was in the context of a game world where you were just going to wander through and find these poetic elements that had something to do with what you'd been doing so far, so it was a little bit tied into the narrative, but I wanted it to kind of go off in its own poetic direction. And the end of each poem, the line would be drawn from this corpus of proverbs. So I was playing with this, looking at what was coming out of it, having a great time, until I got a poem where it said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And again, I was like, no, that is not something that I would write. That is not something that I can allow to have in my game. So it's really important, if you're taking this kind of approach, there's some beautiful and interesting things that you can get out of the system, but the relationship that we need to have with that kind of approach is one of curation. You can say, like, it's fine for the AI to be my muse, to guide me, to come up with these juxtapositions that tell me something about humanity or that reveal some sort of dream or nightmare that I wouldn't have thought of by myself. I can have gameplay that's about exploring those generated meanings, but there are some really important kind of ethical limits on what we do with that make us responsible for making sure that the corpora that we're using, basically what we're feeding the machine on, is acceptable, and that then the juxtaposition of elements that come out of that are acceptable as well. And then the final point that I wanted to talk about is actually what I'm working on now in a commercial capacity. So I'm the product manager on Character Engine at Spirit AI. I mentioned earlier we build middleware for games. And Character Engine is designed to support characters, getting back to that sort of first experience that I had with this kind of thing, who have a memory of where your conversation has gone so far, have the ability to draw in things that they want to say to you from their narrative goals. So they know, oh, I'm in this particular scene. The scene begins in a certain way, but then there are some other elements that are on topic for that scene. Then there are a couple of ways that the scene can end. So the character is dynamically drawing from those, but then also has a base of additional knowledge about the world that it lives in. And it can kind of pull these things together and then also do some text generation on them to decide, I'm going to rephrase this slightly. I'm going to speak to you with different vocabulary. I'm going to put different emphasis. I'm going to insert some ums and ers because I'm nervous. All of those kinds of things in order to reify the emotional moment that it's in right then. So kind of as a high-level set of goals, we want these characters to be true to the scene that they're in, true to their character personality, and responsive to a wide range of player input, so that if you've built up a particular attitude in the character that you're talking to over the previous course of the scene, that's going to start to reflect back to you in how they talk to you. So there are a couple of different ways of using Character Engine, and one of the ways that we've experimented with is actually having the system generate dynamically what the player's lines might be as well. So it's basically, instead of having a standard dialogue tree, what you have is a selection of 3 or 4 options of what the player might say next, but those are actually being calculated in the moment on the basis of where the narrative is and also who the protagonist has proven themselves to be. So if you've decided, like, okay, I'm a piratical character, all of my utterances are going to have a lot of args in them, that can be brought in as part of the character dialogue generation for the protagonist. But the other thing that we've been exploring is actually allowing natural language input. And you might think, well, okay, nobody wants to type in their game, but this is something that's actually become more relevant as we get into VR, AR contexts where we might be using speech-to-text more frequently. We don't want to be tied to some of the same controllers that we've always been using. So this is actually a few screens I was just going to show you from the demo that we made for GDC earlier this year. And I'll kind of talk through what's going on here. So the backstory of this is you're interrogating this robot. It's kind of an iRobot-like scenario. She has been present at a murder, but some of her data has been wiped. She doesn't remember everything perfectly, so we're really interrogating her. So it's very much a player-led conversation with this character. And she's got a concept of, okay, we're in a social situation with the player, so I've greeted you. It would be appropriate for you to greet me back. If you don't, then maybe I'll rate that as a little bit strange and have a reaction to that fact. So she tells us, I see you've come on as a fresh detective in this killing. If you restarted the demo a bunch of times, you get slightly different ways for her to say that, because even if she doesn't have a lot of emotional context yet, nothing's happened yet in the game, she still is doing a certain amount of randomization on her text production. So I type, hello there, and she says, the police have been slow to understand my situation. What do they call you? I give her my name. I'm going to call myself Harrison. I don't really know why I went with that for this demo, but it might be a little bit of Blade Runner influence. She says, nice to meet you, Harrison. For what it's worth, I'm not guilty of this crime. And now I can start asking her questions about what she's talking about. So I can say, which crime is that? And what's going on under the surface is combination of sort of standard looking for keywords that you might have seen in older systems, but also using machine learning trained natural language classifiers to look for things like, is what you're saying insulting? Is it polite? Is it a particular type of question that I can recognize? And if so, how can I apply that recognition to determine what I should be saying back to you? So when I've asked her this, she tells us a little bit about the murder scenario. And again, she's constructing exactly how she says that to us on the basis of the conversation context she has thus far. So she says, this victim was murdered at Valtrox, which is the company that built me. And she's giving us a little bit of extra information about this company, which she does because she knows that she hasn't talked to us about the company before. It's not something that's entered the context of our conversation previously, and therefore she needs to tell us a little bit more about it. Whereas if we were coming to that information at a different time, she would just say Valtrox or just say it and use a pronoun. So that's the kind of, she's doing that kind of immediate context modeling and having that affect her language output. And so I can kind of keep asking her questions and go back and forth with this. And I can also, and I don't have sort of slides for many minutes of demo, but I can also take this in some other directions, like becoming more aggressive with her, putting her in a situation where she starts to feel and express anxiety. So if I say like a number of things like, I don't believe you, I don't trust you, I think you did it, she starts bringing that into her sort of concept of what her active emotions are. She becomes less trustful of you, she becomes anxious, and her anxiety expresses itself in the language that she chooses to use, because we're generating output that expresses anxiety. And also she starts to use more language disfluencies, so more ums and ers, more pauses, more awkwardness. And you can kind of shift the tone of this conversation and her willingness to suggest new information to you. The system also has the ability to let the NPC drive the conversation a bit more than it does in this example. So in this case, this is an interaction with a character who is very much in your power. You're there to interrogate her, to see if you think she's guilty, and if you do, it's probably curtains for her. Even if you don't think she's innocent, it's probably bad for her. So she's not driving the conversation very much, but the system can also do things where it's introducing new utterances from the NPC as well, and having the NPC drive towards particular conclusions and bring the player back onto what the main storyline is supposed to be. So kind of hinting you towards that dynamic experience with a lot of back and forth, but still with a narrative goal. So we talk about this as in terms of creating an improvisational scenario where, as the author, you're putting certain pieces into it. It's never going to come out with some piece of dialogue, Tay-like, that it's learned that's totally inappropriate to the situation, but it is going to reweave the things that it knows are part of its available narrative to give you in order to provide an experience that's kind of tightly connected to what the player is actually doing. So what that makes, for this particular demo, what that does with the gameplay is it creates the possibility of a conversation that traverses a space of dialogue and emotions and concepts in the way that another game might traverse a physical map. So there are all of these things that she knows about in her backstory that you can ask her about that are going to lead to her mentioning additional topics. And so as a game designer, you can kind of say, all right, I want her to lead us into knowing about these additional things, but I don't want it to be obvious. And so I'm going to place certain pieces of information kind of deeper in this tree in the same way that on a physical map, you might place certain pieces of information deeper in the map or deeper in a cave. So this is an example of really pulling together a number of different kinds of AI, both in the kind of more research-oriented machine learning, creating these natural language classifiers, interpreting incoming speech, and doing a lot of iteration on incoming data. So another thing that we've done a lot of is put this system in front of players, see what they say to it, and see whether there are categories of things that people say to the system that we hadn't anticipated, and bring that back into, like, let's make sure that we can understand this when it's being said, but also maybe that becomes partly part of the artistic inspiration as well. As an author, sort of realizing, oh, people are going to want to interact with this in these particular ways. Maybe I need to consider whether I want to account for that or not. So that's driving both the technology and also some input to kind of what the creative experience of that system is. At the same time, once it has established that understanding of, okay, here are the classifiers that I understood from what you said, and these are the keywords that I understood, these are the entities you're referring to in my game world, I've constructed an understanding of what you're asking me about. Then she's looking at all of her available responses and scoring them in a much more traditional game AI way of like, here are the things that are probably the best match to what you said, and I'm also influencing that best match scoring based on what I know about where we are in the conversation, what we've already talked about. I don't want to repeat myself, so I'm going to score appropriately in that way. And also some social model elements, though with fewer built-in expectations than Versu. So we have some social models here, but they're not sort of full-length social practices that are many turns long. Instead, they're a little bit more dynamic as just a way of setting up, in this particular moment, what is this character likely to expect as a response versus what would be an unexpected thing? And are there things in the context of this moment that would have a different meaning than they would have at another time? And then that system is also pulling in, we're looking at using some data science around player modeling. So that brings in the idea, and now I'm describing something that the system doesn't do yet, but is kind of a research topic for us, looking at ways that different players move through game spaces and interact with the lore, so that we could say things like, okay, we know that in lots of MMOs, some people really like the lore and really want to know a lot of backstory. Some people just want to get the quest and kill a bunch of rats and get out of there. So in that case, like, we might actually change how the NPC speaks to different players depending on what we know about their preferences. This one would really love to hear a long backstory. That one doesn't want to hear it, so we'll be appropriately careful. And then finally, the text generation. Once she's determined, like, here's the basics of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to put some changes on that, that's pulling, again, out of curated corpora. So it's not just kind of a huge sack of possible things to say. That's being controlled from the author's point of view, with the aim of making a character that feels convincingly embedded in a story. So this is something that a lot of sort of traditional chatbots, in my opinion, don't fully achieve. Like, you can get characters that seem to exist from moment to moment that have a good answer for 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, but don't necessarily have a persistent memory, don't necessarily have a way that they're relating to the world that they're in, or the ability to respond to events within the world that they're in an interesting and persuasive way. So I think there are a lot of powerful things that we can do, that we can bring into games, if we take the kind of game AI approach of what is the experience that we want to facilitate, and what are the experiences we want to avoid facilitating. For instance, encounters with horribly racist or sexist moments in the game. What are those kind of filters that we want to bring, but actually returning to some of the possibilities of research AI and asking how we can bring those into what we're doing. And then finally, the question that people always wind up asking me about this is like, okay, but how far are we off from that, right? Like, where's my computer girlfriend? Are we there yet? Are we going to have this anytime soon? I've seen some impressive examples, how far away, and so on. To some degree, I think that's many years off before we get to something that can think and present itself like a human being, because there are so many layers to making that a reality. But I also think that if our approach is to program something that is always friendly, kind, obedient, and safe, and then say, and that also needs to be completely like a human being, I think that's impossible, because we're not kind, obedient, and safe at all times. It's not impossible because of the uncanny valley. It's not just because we can't make a mind like a human mind. And in particular, I think the idea of, can we make an artificial intelligence that we could be friends with, which I think is a really powerful attractor for a lot of people, this idea of, like, I could have this buddy that, like, really understands me but lives in my pocket. That's something that I think is not just technologically impossible, I think it's, like, morally impossible, because it's meaningless to achieve friendship with something that is compelled to like you. If it has a rule built into it that says, like, you will be best friends with this human, you will always pay the most attention to human players and not to each other as a built-in condition of how that character is coded, that's never going to be really your friend. At best, if we put those parameters on it, what we get is not an artificial intelligence friend, but an artificial intelligence pet. And that might be OK, because pets are cute. Although, even so, that doesn't always work, right? Not even our pets always behave that way. So is this hopeless? Is there a point in pursuing kind of the grand dream of AI in that direction? I think I hope that I've convinced at least some people in the room that there's some really amazing and artistically interesting and narratively interesting things that we can be doing with this right now based on existing technology and pulling that existing technology into our existing expectations. But this sort of larger question of where are we going with this overall, I don't know. I think it's not going to be very soon, and it may be never, that we get to this kind of ability to regard AI as human-like. And I think the question of whether we ever do have AI that we regard as human-like will also depend on our willingness to extend the rights and benefits of humanity to entities very much unlike ourselves. And whether we're ever ready to do that depends more on us than on our technology. But I think long before we create anything like sentience, in trying to capture aspects of ourselves in artificial means, our language, our art, our values, our emotions, our psychology, our social dynamics, by building models that might be wrong or might make us uncomfortable, by observing the distance between game mechanics that serve our fantasies and simulation mechanics that represent reality, by analyzing large amounts of social data, by using AI to model and reflect these aspects, we're engaged in an artistic practice of self-revelation that belongs to the broader artistic culture. And even if the reflection in the uncanny mirror is sometimes frightening or strange or seemingly wrong, our games that use AI and our art that builds from AI may reflect unexpected truths that are the beginning of wisdom. So, from there, if you would like to play more with some of the tools and possibilities in this space, these are a couple of resources that I personally have found useful and interesting, and then there are also a couple references to me in addition. So if anybody wants to photo that or get in touch with me. Thank you very much for your attention. I know it's late and I'm the last person on stage, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, I would be happy to take questions if people have some. I wanted to leave myself a few minutes just in case.
Thanks for your talk. It's been nice. I have a question about programming. I really don't understand how programming works. I'm an artist, but it is really interesting to hear about programming. Mm-hmm. You talked a couple of times about improvisation. Can improvisation be programmed? I mean, can you get something unexpected from from a programmed behavior?
Yes.
I think that.
Yes. No. That's a good and in fact often asked question. So something people often ask me about my work is, did it produce something that you didn't expect, right? As kind of a baseline of like, why, the reason for doing this at all would be to get the computer to collaborate with you in some way that you wouldn't have come up with by yourself. And the answer is you get both surprising results that are good and sometimes surprising results that are bad. So what I always say about this is, what I want is for the system to be surprising, but only in expected ways, and not surprising in unexpected ways, because that's usually a bad surprise. So what I mean by that is it's wonderful when the system is built in such a way that it responds to a moment that happens kind of procedurally as the result of play that you as the author hadn't particularly thought of in advance, but then it moves forward really naturally and possibly even produces kind of its own humor. And the example that I go to for that is actually for Versu. We had all of these characters who had banks of conversation about different topics, and we had rules for how you can have a conversation. And we'd actually, just as an experimental prototype, we'd taken some characters that we'd written for an office comedy and some other characters that we had written for a kind of historical romance story. And we put them together and had them play a card game. We programmed a game of cards. And while they're playing cards, they're talking about various topics. And there's a character named Patrick who's kind of a frat bro character, and he starts boasting about how many women he's sleeping with. And because that set the topic of conversation to be about sex and sexual behavior, then this other character, who is like this crusty old 18th century admiral character, starts talking about like how when he was in the Pacific with his sailors, they all got venereal diseases. And it was a wonderful moment because obviously like these characters had not been written to speak to one another at all. Like that was never the intent of creating that content in the first place. But when they were juxtaposed like that, it felt like some new comedy was coming out of that moment because it felt like the admiral was like kind of jabbing at the frat guy for sleeping around so much, which is just, you know, that was there. It was creating a new meaning in that moment by the way that it was pulling those pieces together.
I have one. First, thanks for your talk. It's been a great, very, very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to know a little bit more about Spirit AI.
Okay.
About the vision of the company, the business model. If you is it a service, how does it work?
Okay. So Spirit AI, the vision of the company overall is very much about how do we bring more humanity, more perception into our interactions with the digital world. So games to start with, but eventually possibly in other areas as well. And so we currently have two products, one of which is Character Engine, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and the other is Ally, which is a product that looks at kind of conversation within a community setting and identifies what's toxic behavior, looks at networks of how people are interacting in this space to go a little bit deeper than just kind of ticketing, oh, somebody used a bad word, to actually find some dynamics that go a bit deeper than that, and also look at positive influencers in a community space and create ways for the community manager to interact with that situation. Like, do we want to reward or recognize players who are really adding value to our community and helping people be retained in this space? So that's that piece. And then Character Engine, which is the piece that I showed demo from and that I'm the product manager for, we currently have an SDK for Unity. We're building C++ SDK, so it'll be more available on a wider range of platforms. And we're at the moment working with specific co-development partners to make sure that we're able to serve what they need in their games and sort of take that feedback and have a back and forth about kind of building up the behavior of the engine and also the tool set, because something I didn't show here at all is that we have a specialized tool set to allow you to script and then have the tool automatically attach, like, you know, you've written, okay, an example of a player line that I would want to respond to is, you know, hello, idiot. And then the tool goes and looks at that and says, okay, according to my classifiers, that line was a greeting and also an insult, and I'm going to tag it up that way so that as an author, you don't have to fully understand all of the natural language capacities of the system in order to make use of it. And then, as I say, there are also, if you want to do something that's not natural language based, there are other ways of applying that tool as well. So that is going to be, in the longer term, a fairly conventional licensing model with tiers of cost that we hope at least will facilitate a full range of, you know, high-end to low-end studios making use of that. A lot of the people at Spirit, myself included, come from a background of either academic research or independent and hobbyist game making, and we really appreciate the power of those communities to drive innovation and the worth of having the range of diversity that you get from including those people. And so it matters to us to try and make our tools not completely inaccessible at that end of the market as well. Anything else? Okay. Thanks very much.